The millionaire's daughter was paralyzed upon seeing a waiter wearing a watch identical to one her brother wore before he vanished 15 years ago. Before we dive into the story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. Stay tuned until the end, things are about to get intense. Now, let's get into it. The grand ballroom sparkled with festive elegance, its high ceilings adorned with cascading garlands of twinkling lights and deep crimson ribbons. Golden chandeliers reflected a warm glow onto the faces of the city's elite, mingling over champagne and hors d'oeuvres. In the heart of it all stood Elizabeth Carter, effortlessly poised in an emerald green gown that seemed tailored to perfection for her tall, graceful frame. She wore a polite smile, her composure immaculate, though the tight clutch of her manicured fingers around her champagne glass betrayed a hint of tension. Elizabeth had mastered the art of the perfect facade. As the eldest daughter of James Carter, a man who commanded respect in every room he entered, it was practically a requirement. Yet tonight, like every Christmas season for the past 15 years, the memory of her brother Michael pressed heavily against her. Michael had been the heart of their family, mischievous and kind, the glue that held them together. His disappearance during the holidays left a void no amount of luxury or philanthropy could fill. And though she was expected to host the evening with effortless charm, Elizabeth couldn't help but feel that the gala only highlighted the distance between the family they pretended to be and the one they truly were. Elizabeth's mind spun, but for a brief moment, the sight of the watch transported her to a happier time, a Christmas morning years ago when everything felt whole. For years, their Christmases had been filled with warmth and a sense of magic only the two of them truly shared. Michael always knew how to make her laugh, whether it was sneaking an extra cookie when their father wasn't looking or turning carol lyrics into ridiculous rhymes that had them both in stitches. Even when the expectations of being a Carter weighed on their young shoulders, Michael had a way of making it all feel lighter. They were a team, a quiet promise between them that no matter what, they'd always look out for each other. But all of that changed 15 years ago. It had been another Christmas Eve, their home alive with guests for the annual gala. Michael had seemed restless that night, not his usual mischievous self. Elizabeth had noticed him slipping out to the garden, seeking a quiet moment away from the clamor. She'd followed him, but he'd brushed her off, muttering something about needing air. That was the last time she saw him. Hours later, when she returned to the party, she realized Michael hadn't come back. Panic set in as the minutes turned to hours. By morning, it was clear he was gone. The police were called, search parties formed, and the press descended on their family like vultures. Every possible lead was pursued, but nothing led to him. No ransom note, no signs of foul play, just Michael's sudden, unexplainable disappearance. The last shred of him they found was a shoe, abandoned in the woods bordering their property, but even that clue yielded no answers. The days after were a haze of confusion and heartache. Elizabeth remembered her mother crying endlessly, her father barking orders at investigators, and the feeling that everything stable in her world had crumbled. Christmases afterward became somber affairs, stripped of the joy and laughter they once knew. Her mother passed only a year later, some said of a broken heart, though the doctors called it a stroke. Elizabeth wasn't sure there was much difference. The years that followed were a slow unraveling. Their mother's health declined rapidly after Michael's disappearance, her heartbreak consuming her. She passed away the next Christmas, leaving Elizabeth to navigate the weight of her grief alone. Her father buried himself in his philanthropic endeavors, his stoic demeanor masking a pain he refused to acknowledge. Elizabeth was left to play the dutiful daughter, organizing galas, managing public appearances, and pretending her family was still intact. But Christmas had lost its magic. The joy that once defined the season had been replaced with a cold, hollow sense of duty. Though the investigations eventually tapered off, Elizabeth never truly let go of the hope that Michael was alive. She carried his memory like a quiet ache, her own personal secret, too painful to share. Occasionally, she'd catch herself scanning crowds for a face that matched his, or hearing a laugh that sounded like his. There was always a part of her that wondered, what if he'd just walked away? What if he didn't want to be found? It was a thought she couldn't bear to entertain for long. A waiter brushed past her, offering a tray of sparkling flutes, and Elizabeth reflexively stepped aside, murmuring a soft thanks. Her father's familiar voice boomed from across the room as he greeted a prominent donor, his laughter resonating over the melodic hum of the string quartet. She glanced at him, his broad frame clad in a crisp black tuxedo, and wondered if he ever allowed himself to grieve the way she did. If he still remembered the way Michael used to sneak extra desserts at these parties or twirl around the Christmas tree until their mother begged him to stop. Elizabeth, a friend of her father's, approached, drawing her attention with a jovial wave. "You've outdone yourself this year. Truly, the decorations are a triumph." "Thank you," she replied with practiced ease, her smile automatic. The conversation felt distant, her replies mechanical. She made an excuse to step away, weaving through the crowd toward the bar for a moment of quiet. As she sipped her champagne, her eyes wandered to the staff moving gracefully through the crowd. Waiters balanced silver trays of delicate canapés, their steps measured and unobtrusive. One in particular caught her attention, not for his posture or demeanor, but for something far more startling. A glint of gold on his wrist caught the soft glow of the chandelier. The waiter turned slightly, and Elizabeth's breath hitched. It couldn't be. The watch on his wrist was unmistakable. The thin gold band, the small inscription barely visible beneath the gleaming surface, it was Michael's. Her hand trembled, and she set her glass down abruptly, the stem clinking against the marble countertop. Memories rushed in, vivid and unrelenting. She was 7, Michael 10, and the two of them had woken up before dawn, their giggles muffled as they tiptoed down the grand staircase of the Carter estate. The tree stood resplendent in the dim glow of fairy lights, its branches heavy with ornaments collected over the years. Michael had insisted on being the one to open the first gift. It was a race between them, unwrapping ribbons and tearing paper with giddy excitement, their laughter filling the cavernous living room. That was the year their mother had given Michael the watch. She'd knelt beside him, her arms draped around his small shoulders, and explained how special it was, engraved with their family crest, a piece of Carter history. "This isn't just any watch," their mother had said, kneeling beside him with a soft smile. "It's a part of who we are. Something special for you to carry always." Michael had stared at it, awestruck. "Always," he had promised, flashing the watch at Elizabeth with a grin. She had teased him mercilessly for days afterward, calling it too fancy for a kid, but deep down, she had admired how proud he was. It wasn't just a watch, it was a piece of him. There was no way it could be a coincidence. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She inhaled sharply, choking on the champagne as it slid the wrong way down her throat. A spluttering cough escaped her lips, and she quickly pressed her hand to her mouth, her cheeks burning as a few nearby guests turned toward the sound. "Elizabeth, are you all right?" one of them asked, concern flickering across their face. She waved them off, barely registering their voice. "I'm fine," she croaked, her voice hoarse. But she wasn't fine. Her heart was pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. The room, the music, the conversations, all of it blurred into the background as she stared at the waiter. Her fingers tightened around the delicate stem of her glass, her breath coming in shallow bursts. It can't be. How is this possible? She forced herself to swallow the remaining discomfort in her throat, her mind racing. There was no mistaking that watch. She had held it in her hands countless times, a tangible piece of her brother that she'd clung to after he disappeared. Yet here it was, on the wrist of a stranger. For a moment, she couldn't move, as though her feet were rooted to the marble floor. A cold wave of disbelief swept over her, mingled with something else, something dangerously close to hope. Elizabeth's heels clicked against the polished marble floor as she followed the waiter, her heart racing. Her gaze remained locked on the golden watch glinting on his wrist. It was as though the room had dimmed, the cheerful chatter and soft music reduced to background noise. All she could think about was that familiar piece of jewelry, a connection to her brother, long lost but never forgotten. She quickened her pace, catching up just as the waiter paused near the edge of the ballroom to collect empty glasses. "Excuse me," she said, her voice tight with urgency. The young man turned, startled by her sudden presence. He was tall, with sharp features and a look of polite professionalism that faltered under the weight of her intense stare. "Yes, ma'am." Her eyes flicked to his wrist, the watch now partially hidden beneath his shirt cuff. "Where did you get that watch?" she asked, her voice low but firm. The waiter followed her gaze, then instinctively shifted his arm behind his back. "I'm sorry, I don't understand." "That watch," she interrupted, her tone sharper now. "It belonged to my brother. It's unique. One of a kind. I need to know where you got it." The man hesitated, clearly uncomfortable under her scrutiny. He looked around as though seeking an escape, then cleared his throat. "I was given this watch." "It's a gift," he said evenly, though there was a slight quiver in his voice. Elizabeth wasn't satisfied. "By who?" she pressed, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "This isn't just some random accessory. It has sentimental value. I need you to tell me." "I don't think that's your business," the waiter said abruptly, cutting her off. His polite facade cracked just enough to reveal a flicker of defensiveness. "I don't owe you an explanation." The abruptness of his response stung, but Elizabeth wasn't backing down. "It is my business," she said, her voice rising just enough to draw attention from nearby guests. "That watch was my brother's. He disappeared 15 years ago. If you know something, anything." "Elizabeth." Her father's voice boomed from across the room. She froze, turning to see James Carter striding toward her, his commanding presence immediately silencing the growing whispers around them. His expression was a mix of irritation and concern, the kind of look he reserved for moments when she was stepping out of line, or at least what he considered out of line. "May I ask what's going on here?" James addressed her with the practiced calm of a man accustomed to diffusing difficult situations. He glanced briefly at the waiter, who stood stiffly, clearly wishing to be anywhere else. Elizabeth opened her mouth to explain, but James held up a hand, silencing her. "This is neither the time nor the place," he said firmly, his tone low enough to keep their conversation somewhat private but carrying enough authority to make it clear he expected compliance. "But, Dad," she began, her frustration mounting. "No," he said, his voice hardening. "I'm not having this discussion here. You're upsetting our guests." She stared at him in disbelief, her emotions simmering just beneath the surface. "Do you see what he's wearing?" she said, gesturing toward the watch. "It's Michael's. His watch. This isn't a coincidence." James sighed heavily, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Elizabeth, I know you miss your brother. We all do. But this is reaching. There are thousands of watches that look similar." "It's not similar," she snapped, her voice louder now. "It's his. You know it is." The tension between them was palpable, drawing even more curious glances from the crowd. James noticed and gave the waiter a curt nod. "You're excused," he said dismissively. The young man didn't hesitate, quickly retreating toward the kitchen with his tray in hand. Elizabeth took a step forward as though to follow, but her father grabbed her arm gently, his grip firm. "Enough," he said in a hushed tone. "This is not how we handle things." "How we handle things?" Elizabeth repeated, incredulous. He could know something. He could have seen Michael. James shook his head, his expression softening just slightly. "It's been 15 years, Elizabeth. You need to let this go." Her chest tightened at his words, the familiar wall of his detachment slamming down between them. It wasn't the first time he dismissed her instincts, but it didn't make it hurt any less. She pulled her arm free and straightened her posture, her voice steely now. "I'm not letting this go." James sighed again, his shoulders sagging slightly, but he didn't argue further. Instead, he turned and walked back toward the center of the room, seamlessly rejoining the mingling guests as though nothing had happened. Elizabeth stood there, her emotions swirling in a chaotic storm of anger, disbelief, and determination. As she watched her father retreat, a faint murmur reached her ears. She turned her head, her eyes narrowing as she caught sight of the same waiter speaking in hushed tones to another staff member near the kitchen door. The words were barely audible over the din of the party, but one phrase stood out: the shelter. Elizabeth's pulse quickened. A shelter? She didn't catch the rest of the conversation, but it was enough to ignite a spark of curiosity and resolve. If her father wasn't going to support her, she'd pursue the truth herself. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. As the waiter disappeared into the back, she slipped out of the ballroom, her mind already racing with plans. If this man knew something about Michael, she'd find out, even if it meant confronting him again on his own turf. The next morning, Elizabeth pulled her coat tightly around her as she stepped out of her car, a gust of cold air biting at her cheeks. The shelter sat on a quiet street on the edge of town, its brick facade softened by the faint hum of holiday cheer. A wreath hung on the door, and a few strings of colored lights framed the windows. She had spent the night tossing and turning, her mind racing with questions about the waiter, the watch, and the mention of the shelter. The thought of her brother had felt closer, almost tangible, and the only way to settle her unease was to act. She approached the entrance with a carefully balanced tray of cookies and a few shopping bags filled with winter essentials. It was the perfect pretense, a gesture of holiday goodwill that would let her enter without raising suspicions. The receptionist greeted her warmly, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a sweater dotted with tiny reindeer. "Good morning. Are you here to donate?" the woman asked, standing to help Elizabeth with the bags. "Yes," Elizabeth replied, her smile polite but purposeful. "I wanted to drop these off and maybe look around. It's such a beautiful season for giving back, isn't it?" The receptionist beamed at her. "It certainly is. Let me show you where to put everything. We're always grateful for donations, especially this time of year." As the receptionist led her inside, Elizabeth's eyes scanned the room. It was modest but clean, with a few rows of tables and chairs where people gathered, sharing coffee and conversation. A Christmas tree stood in the corner, adorned with mismatched ornaments, and a group of volunteers was arranging boxes of donated goods nearby. Her gaze landed on him. Luke, the waiter from the gala, was leaning against the counter, sorting through a pile of paperwork. He looked different in the light of day, less formal but no less guarded. He glanced up and froze when he saw her, his expression shifting from surprise to thinly veiled suspicion. Elizabeth thanked the receptionist and walked toward him, her heels clicking softly against the tiled floor. "Luke," she said evenly, her voice cutting through the murmur of the room. His eyes narrowed slightly. You again. He folded his arms, straightening. What are you doing here? I brought donations, she said, motioning to the bags being unpacked behind her. And I'd like to talk. Luke sighed, his shoulders tensing. Look, I told you everything I know. If you're here to push me about the watch again, you're wasting your time. I don't think I am, she replied, stepping closer. Her voice softened, her frustration from the previous night replaced by quiet determination. Please, Luke. That watch isn't just a trinket. It belonged to my brother. He disappeared years ago, and I think you know something that could help me find him. Luke hesitated, his gaze darting briefly to the floor before meeting hers again. For a moment, it seemed like he might dismiss her entirely. Then he exhaled deeply, running a hand through his hair. Fine, he said at last. But not here. Follow me. He led her to a smaller, quieter room off the main area, a makeshift office with a few chairs and a cluttered desk. Elizabeth perched on the edge of one chair, her heart pounding as Luke leaned against the desk, his arms crossed. The watch, he began, his voice steady but reluctant, wasn't mine originally. It was given to me by someone I met here at the shelter. An older man. He said it had sentimental value but that he didn't need it anymore. Elizabeth's breath caught. An older man? What was his name? Mike, Luke replied, watching her carefully. At least, that's what he called himself. She felt a flicker of something, hope, fear, she couldn't quite tell. What else did he say? What did he look like? Luke frowned, as though he were trying to piece together a puzzle. He was quiet. Kept to himself most of the time. Maybe in his 40s or early 50s. Dark hair, though there were some gray strands. He seemed like he'd been through a lot, you know? There was this heaviness about him. He paused, studying her reaction. Does that sound like your brother? Elizabeth's chest tightened. Michael would be 35 now, but 15 years of hardship could easily make someone look older than their years. She swallowed hard, her voice trembling. Did he say anything about where he came from? Or why he gave you the watch? Luke shook his head. Not much. He just said he'd carried it long enough and it was time to let go. He left the shelter a couple of weeks ago, and no one's seen him since. The weight of his words sank in, and Elizabeth gripped the edge of her chair. 2 weeks ago, she repeated, her mind racing. He could still be nearby. He had to be. Did he say where he was going? Not exactly, Luke admitted. But there's a diner a few blocks from here where he used to hang out. Maybe someone there's seen him recently. Elizabeth nodded, her determination hardening into resolve. Thank you, she said, her voice firm. I'll find him. Luke watched her for a moment, his expression softening. Look, I don't know if this guy is your brother, he said. But if he is, I hope you find him. And if you need help, just ask. The offer caught her off guard, but she managed a small smile. Thank you, Luke, she said, standing. I might take you up on that. As she left the shelter, her breath misting in the cold air, Elizabeth's thoughts swirled with possibilities. For the first time in years, she felt a spark of real hope. If Mike was Michael, she was closer to finding him than she'd ever been. She would follow every lead, ask every question, and knock on every door if she had to. There was no turning back now. The streets were quieter than Elizabeth expected as she and Luke walked together, their breath visible in the crisp December air. A light dusting of snow coated the sidewalks, the glow of holiday lights reflecting off the icy ground. Clutching her scarf tighter, Elizabeth glanced at the diner up ahead, a modest place with a faded sign and a soft flicker of neon in the window. It was their first stop in what she feared could be a long day, but she was determined. Luke, walking beside her, had agreed to help despite his initial wariness, and for that, she was grateful. He used to come here a lot, Luke said, nodding toward the diner. He wasn't exactly chatty, but he'd always sit at the same booth. Corner seat, near the window. Elizabeth tried to picture it, Michael, older and world-worn, sipping coffee in this little diner. The image felt surreal, but it also gave her a sense of hope she hadn't felt in years. Michael loved diners when we were kids, she said, her voice soft with memory. Mom used to take us to one on Sundays. He'd always order a milkshake, even if it was freezing outside. Said it made the pancakes taste better. Luke chuckled, opening the door for her as they stepped inside. The warmth of the diner enveloped them, carrying the smell of coffee and frying bacon. Sounds like he had his priorities straight, he remarked. Elizabeth smiled faintly. He always did. They approached the counter, where a waitress with tired eyes and a friendly smile greeted them. Elizabeth explained who she was looking for, a man named Mike, possibly in his 40s, who might have been a regular. The waitress's brow furrowed in thought, and she nodded slowly. Yeah, I remember him. Quiet guy. Used to sit in the corner booth, like your friend said. Haven't seen him in a few weeks, though. Did he ever talk about where he was headed? Elizabeth asked, her heart racing with anticipation. The waitress shook her head. Not really. But he left something once. A notebook. I figured he'd come back for it, but he never did. She ducked behind the counter, rummaging through a drawer before pulling out a small, weathered notebook. Here. You can take it. Elizabeth hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she accepted the notebook. The cover was scuffed, the edges worn, and it smelled faintly of coffee and age. She flipped it open, her eyes scanning the pages. The handwriting was hurried and uneven, filled with fragmented sentences and what seemed like jumbled thoughts. Luke leaned in to read over her shoulder. What does it say? Elizabeth frowned, deciphering the words. I want to go back, but I don't know if I can. What if they hate me? What if it's too late? Her voice broke slightly, and she paused to compose herself. They're better off without me. She closed the notebook, her chest tightening. It was Michael's handwriting, she'd recognize it anywhere. He's been carrying this guilt all these years, she murmured, her eyes glistening. Why didn't he just come home? Luke placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch light but steady. Maybe he thought he was protecting you. People do strange things when they're hurting. Elizabeth nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. We have to find him, she said, her voice firm. He's out there somewhere, and he needs to know he's not alone. Their search led them to a park a few blocks away, where another shelter volunteer had mentioned seeing Mike spend time. The playground equipment was dusted with snow, the benches empty, but Elizabeth could almost imagine him sitting there, lost in thought. As they walked, she shared more memories of Michael, how he used to sneak candy canes off the Christmas tree, how he taught her to ice skate, how he once built a snow fort so elaborate it took 3 days to finish. He sounds like he was a great brother, Luke said, his tone warm. He was, Elizabeth replied, glancing at him. But I wasn't always the best sister. I didn't notice how much pressure he was under until it was too late. He was the golden child, the one everyone expected so much from. And I just let him carry that alone. Luke shook his head. You were kids. You can't blame yourself for what happened. She sighed, her breath clouding in the cold air. I know, but it doesn't make it easier. They continued walking, stopping at another spot where Mike had reportedly been seen, a church steps away from the park. The pastor there remembered him too, a man who came in seeking warmth and sometimes sat quietly in the back during evening services. He seemed burdened, the pastor said, but kind. Like someone who'd been through a lot but didn't want to talk about it. Elizabeth felt the weight of those words as they left, clutching the notebook tightly. It was clear Michael had been struggling, but the pieces didn't quite fit together. Why had he stayed away so long? Why had he given up the watch? And where had he gone now? As the afternoon wore on, Elizabeth and Luke found themselves at a small coffee shop, taking a break from the cold. Over steaming cups, they pored over the notebook again, searching for any clues they might have missed. Luke surprised her with how patient and thoughtful he was, pointing out details she might have overlooked and listening intently as she shared more about Michael. You're really close to your family, he observed, leaning back in his chair. I used to be, she admitted. After Michael disappeared, everything changed. My mom was heartbroken, my dad threw himself into work, and I tried to hold everything together. But it was never the same. Luke studied her for a moment. You've got a lot of strength, he said. Most people would have given up by now. Elizabeth shook her head, her lips curving into a faint smile. It's not strength. It's stubbornness. Michael's out there, and I can't stop until I find him. Luke's expression softened, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. Well, I'm glad you're stubborn. He's lucky to have you fighting for him. The Carter estate glowed warmly against the icy backdrop of winter, the expansive home looking as welcoming as ever to anyone passing by. But inside, the atmosphere was anything but calm. Elizabeth stood in her father's study, her hands gripping the notebook she had carried back from the diner, her chest tightening with frustration. Across from her, James Carter sat stiffly in his leather chair, his expression unreadable as he listened to her recount her discoveries. She had just finished explaining about the watch, the shelter, and the notebook, yet his silence lingered, heavy and unyielding. Well? She asked, her voice sharp as she broke the tense quiet. Don't you have anything to say? James leaned back, folding his hands together. His brow furrowed, and his voice was low when he finally spoke. What I have to say, Elizabeth, is that this is absurd. You're chasing ghosts. This man, this Mike, isn't your brother. Elizabeth's jaw clenched, anger bubbling beneath the surface. How can you be so sure? His handwriting matches, his watch. Coincidences, James interrupted, his tone growing harder. Michael is gone, Elizabeth. We've been through this before. Do you think you're the only one who misses him? The only one who wonders what happened? I can't let you drag yourself, or this family, through that pain again. I'm not dragging anyone through anything, she shot back, her voice trembling slightly. I'm trying to find answers. Why are you so determined to stop me? James stood abruptly, his towering frame imposing as he crossed the room to pour himself a drink. Because it's pointless, he said, his words clipped. Do you think I didn't spend years searching for him? Do you think I didn't do everything in my power to find him? The world doesn't always give us the answers we want, Elizabeth. Sometimes we have to move on. The resignation in his voice only fueled her frustration. You gave up, she said, her words biting. Maybe you were tired of looking, or maybe you didn't want to face whatever truth was out there. But I can't, no, I won't, do that. James turned to face her, his eyes narrowing. Don't you dare judge me, he said, his voice low and cold. You have no idea what it was like, holding this family together after your brother disappeared, watching your mother fall apart, trying to protect you from the fallout. I did what I had to do. Protect me, she repeated, incredulous. You shut me out, Dad. You buried yourself in work and pretended everything was fine. That's not protecting anyone. That's avoiding reality. James's expression faltered for a brief moment, but he quickly regained his composure. This conversation is over, he said firmly. I won't let you waste your time chasing fairy tales. Focus on what matters. Let Michael rest. Elizabeth stared at him, stunned by his finality. Rest? She repeated, her voice cracking. He's not dead. He's out there, somewhere, and you're too stubborn to admit it. If you won't help me, fine. But I'm not stopping. Without waiting for a response, she turned on her heel and walked out, the notebook still clutched tightly in her hand. Her father called her name, but she ignored him, her heart pounding as she made her way down the grand hallway. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she blinked them back, her resolve hardening with every step. She wouldn't let him derail her. Not now. Elizabeth barely noticed the cold as she stepped outside, the snow crunching beneath her boots as she crossed the driveway. Her car sat waiting, but she paused, taking a deep breath to steady herself. She felt a hand on her shoulder and turned, startled, to see Luke standing behind her. I heard raised voices, he said, his expression a mix of concern and understanding. Are you okay? She nodded, though the lump in her throat made it hard to speak. It's nothing, she said quietly. Just my father being, my father. Luke tilted his head slightly. Let me guess, he doesn't think you should keep looking. A bitter laugh escaped her. He thinks it's a waste of time. That I'm chasing ghosts. But he's wrong, Luke. I know it's Michael. I can feel it. Luke offered her a small smile, his presence calm and steady. Then trust that, he said simply. You're doing this because it matters to you, not to anyone else. Don't let him make you doubt yourself. His words were a balm to the rawness she felt, and she found herself relaxing, even if just a little. Thank you, she said, her voice soft. It's just hard, you know. He's so convinced he's right. Sometimes I wonder if I'm being foolish. You're not, Luke said firmly. You're following your heart. That's not foolish. It's brave. For a moment, she looked at him, struck by the sincerity in his eyes. He barely knew her, yet he seemed to understand her better than the man who had raised her. It was a strange, comforting thought. I'm lucky you're here, she admitted, offering a faint smile. I don't think I could do this alone. Well, you don't have to, Luke replied, his smile warm. We'll find him, Elizabeth. One step at a time. His certainty gave her strength, and she nodded, tucking the notebook into her bag. Okay, she said. Let's get back to work. The cabin stood alone at the edge of the woods, its weathered exterior blending into the snowy landscape. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, a sign of life that sent a surge of hope through Elizabeth's chest. She glanced at Luke, who nodded silently, his expression a mix of encouragement and caution. They had followed every clue, every whispered lead, and now they were here. Her breath misted in the cold air as she took a step toward the door, her heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and fear. She raised her hand and knocked, the sound echoing through the stillness. For a moment, there was no response. The second stretched uncomfortably, her nerves tightening with each one. Then, the door creaked open just enough for a man to peer out, his face partially obscured by a scruffy beard and a knit cap. His wary eyes met hers, and Elizabeth froze. It was him. "Michael," she whispered, her voice breaking. The man's expression shifted, confusion giving way to something she couldn't quite read, recognition, perhaps, or disbelief. He didn't answer immediately, his hand tightening on the edge of the door. "Who are you?" he asked gruffly, his voice low and hoarse. Elizabeth's throat tightened. "It's me," she said, her eyes filling with tears. "It's Elizabeth. Your sister." Michael's grip on the doorframe faltered, his shoulders sagging slightly. For a moment, he said nothing, his eyes scanning her face as if searching for the truth in her features. Then he opened the door wider, stepping back to let them in. The cabin was small and sparse, with a wood-burning stove in one corner and a single table cluttered with books and papers. A bedroll lay on the floor near the stove, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and pine. "Come in," he said finally, his voice softer now. "It's cold out." Elizabeth stepped inside, her breath catching as she took in the sight of him. He was thinner than she remembered, his hair streaked with gray and his face lined with years of hardship. But it was undeniably Michael. She fought the urge to throw her arms around him, sensing the walls he had built around himself. Luke followed, closing the door quietly behind them. "Michael," he said gently, as if testing the name. "We've been looking for you." Michael's eyes flicked to Luke, then back to Elizabeth. He ran a hand through his unkempt hair, his movements slow and deliberate. "Why?" he asked, his tone flat. "Why now?" Elizabeth stepped closer, her voice trembling. "Because I never stopped looking. Michael, I thought you were gone forever. When I saw the watch, I knew it had to be you." At the mention of the watch, Michael's gaze dropped to his wrist, now bare. "I gave it away," he said quietly. "Didn't think I'd need it anymore." "You were wrong," Elizabeth said, her voice firm despite the tears threatening to spill. "You belong with us. With your family." Michael laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "Family," he repeated, the word heavy with irony. "The family I walked away from? The one I couldn't live up to? You don't know what it was like, Lizzie. The pressure, the expectations. I felt like I was suffocating." Elizabeth flinched at the old nickname, a relic of their childhood. "You should have told me," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We could have figured it out together." Michael looked at her, his eyes haunted. "I didn't think you'd understand. I didn't think anyone would." He paused, his gaze drifting to the fire crackling in the stove. "And then I got into that accident. I was trying to leave town, but the roads were icy. My car slid off the highway. I hit my head, hard. For weeks, I couldn't remember who I was or where I was supposed to go. By the time the pieces started coming back, I thought it was too late. That you'd moved on." Elizabeth's heart broke at his words. She reached for his hand, her fingers trembling as they brushed against his. "We never moved on," she said softly. "I never stopped thinking about you, wondering if you were okay. You didn't have to go through this alone." Michael pulled his hand away, his expression guarded. "You don't understand, Lizzie. I didn't just leave because of Dad or the accident. I left because I didn't think I belonged. All those galas, the charity events, the expectations, it wasn't me. I couldn't be the perfect son Dad wanted." Elizabeth's tears spilled over, her voice breaking as she spoke. "You didn't have to be perfect. You just had to be you. We missed you, Michael. Every day." Luke, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. "She's telling the truth," he said, his voice steady. Elizabeth's been fighting for you since the moment she found that watch. She wouldn't stop, no matter what anyone said. Michael looked at Luke, then back at Elizabeth, his defenses softening slightly. Dad wouldn't want me back, he said quietly. Not after all this time. That's not true, Elizabeth said, her voice firm. He's stubborn, but he loves you. He just doesn't know how to show it. Please, Michael. Come home for Christmas. Let's figure this out together. Michael hesitated, his gaze flickering between her and the fire. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackling of the logs and the faint whistle of the wind outside. Then, finally, he nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. Okay, he said. I'll come. Elizabeth let out a shaky breath, relief washing over her. She stepped forward, wrapping her arms around him despite his initial resistance. After a moment, he hugged her back, his grip tentative but real. She felt the years of distance between them begin to fade, replaced by the fragile beginnings of something new. As they pulled apart, Michael glanced at Luke. You must be pretty determined to put up with all this, he said, a hint of wry humor in his voice. Luke smiled. She's not someone you say no to. The drive back to the Carter estate was quiet, the hum of the car's engine the only sound as snow began to fall lightly, dusting the road ahead. Elizabeth sat in the passenger seat, glancing over her shoulder every so often at Michael, who was staring out the window, his expression unreadable. His hands rested in his lap, fingers fidgeting slightly, as if he were trying to prepare himself for what was to come. Beside her, Luke drove carefully, the weight of the moment making the air feel heavier than the snowfall outside. Are you sure about this? Michael asked finally, breaking the silence. His voice was low, uncertain. What if I go back and it just doesn't work? What if it's worse than before? Elizabeth turned to face him, her gaze steady. It's not going to be worse, she said softly. Because this time, we're going to do it differently. We're not the same people we were 15 years ago, Michael. We've all changed. And we need you home. Michael didn't reply, but he nodded faintly, his eyes returning to the window. Elizabeth wished she could take away his doubt, his guilt, but she knew this was a step he had to take on his own terms. She reached back, her hand brushing against his. We're with you, she said simply. When they arrived, the estate looked as imposing as ever, its grand stone facade softened by the glow of warm light spilling from the windows. The sight brought a lump to Elizabeth's throat. For years, she had dreamed of this moment, bringing Michael back here, back where he belonged. But now that it was happening, the reality of it felt almost too fragile to hold. Luke parked the car, and they all stepped out into the cold. Michael lingered by the door, his hesitation palpable. Elizabeth walked around to him, placing a hand on his arm. We're just going inside, she said gently. That's all you have to do for now. He nodded again, and together, they walked toward the front door. Elizabeth opened it, stepping into the warm glow of the entryway. James Carter was in the living room, standing by the fireplace, a glass of brandy in his hand. He looked up at the sound of the door, his brow furrowing slightly when he saw Elizabeth and Luke. But then his eyes landed on Michael, and the glass in his hand wavered slightly. He set it down carefully, his expression shifting from confusion to something deeper, shock, disbelief, and something else Elizabeth couldn't quite name. For a long moment, no one spoke. Michael, James said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Michael hesitated, his shoulders tense. Hi, Dad. The words hung in the air, raw and tentative. James took a step forward, then stopped, as if unsure whether to close the distance. His face was a mixture of emotions, the kind Elizabeth had rarely seen him express. "Is it really you?" he asked, his voice breaking slightly. "It's me," Michael said, his tone guarded. I'm back." James's composure cracked. He took another step forward, then another, until he was standing in front of his son. For a moment, he just looked at him, his hands trembling slightly. Then he pulled Michael into a tight embrace, his shoulders shaking as he held him. "I thought I'd lost you," James said, his voice muffled. "I thought you were gone forever." Michael stood stiffly at first, but slowly, he relaxed, his arms wrapping around his father. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to leave like that. I didn't know how to come back." James pulled back slightly, his hands still on Michael's shoulders. "It doesn't matter now," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're here. That's all that matters." Elizabeth watched, tears streaming down her face, her heart swelling with relief. Luke stepped closer to her, offering a comforting hand on her back. She looked up at him and smiled through her tears, grateful for his steady presence. As they all sat down in the living room, the initial shock gave way to conversation. Michael shared bits and pieces of his story, his voice hesitant but honest. He talked about the accident, about how lost he had felt, and about the fear that had kept him from reaching out. James listened intently, his expression one of regret and deep sadness. "I pushed you too hard," James admitted, his voice heavy. "I wanted so much for you to succeed, to live up to this family's name, that I forgot what was more important, your happiness. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I see now that I was wrong." Michael looked at him, his eyes reflecting a mixture of pain and forgiveness. "I just wanted to be enough," he said quietly. "But it always felt like I wasn't." "You were always enough," James said firmly, his voice breaking. "I just didn't show you the way I should have. I'm so sorry, Michael. For everything." Elizabeth watched the exchange, her heart aching but also swelling with hope. For so many years, their family had been fractured, held together only by the thinnest threads. But now, sitting together in this room, it felt like those pieces were starting to come back together. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Later, as the fire crackled softly in the hearth, Elizabeth sat with Luke on the couch, her head resting on her hand. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "I am," she said. "For the first time in a long time." Luke returned her smile, his eyes warm. "You did it," he said. "You brought him home." Elizabeth shook her head. "We did it," she corrected. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." As the night wore on, Elizabeth felt a sense of peace settle over her. She realized now that family wasn't about being perfect or living up to impossible standards. It was about showing up for each other, even when it was hard. It was about forgiveness, love, and making space for each other's flaws and struggles. Looking around the room, at Michael, at her father, at Luke, she felt a spark of hope for the future. This was just the beginning, but it was enough. For now, it was enough. Christmas morning arrived with a quiet stillness that blanketed the Carter estate, the gentle fall of snow outside matching the peace Elizabeth felt within for the first time in years. The house, usually formal and imposing, now felt alive with warmth and laughter as the family gathered by the grand tree. Twinkling lights reflected off carefully wrapped presents, the scent of pine mingling with freshly brewed coffee and cinnamon from the pastries Luke had insisted on bringing from his favorite bakery. Michael sat on the couch, a steaming mug in his hands, looking more relaxed than Elizabeth had seen him since they found him. His hair was neater, his beard trimmed, and though there was still a quiet hesitance in his demeanor, the walls he'd built over the years were beginning to come down. Elizabeth sat beside him, smiling as James handed out gifts, his usually stoic face softened by genuine happiness. "Here's one for you, Michael," James said, holding a small box wrapped in silver paper. Michael blinked in surprise, taking the gift with a tentative smile. "Thanks, Dad." The room grew quiet as Michael opened the box, revealing a sleek leather journal. Embossed on the cover were his initials, subtle and elegant. He ran his fingers over the leather, his throat working as he tried to find the right words. "I thought it might help," James said, his voice tentative. "To put things down. Your thoughts, your stories, whatever you need." Michael nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "It's perfect. Thank you." Elizabeth's heart swelled as she watched the exchange. This was what she'd always dreamed of, her family together again, connected in a way that felt real and unforced. The moment felt fragile, like a snowflake landing softly on her hand, and she wanted to hold on to it as long as possible. As the morning unfolded, the room filled with laughter and conversation. Michael shared snippets of his life over the past 15 years, carefully at first, but with growing confidence as he saw their genuine interest. He talked about the people he'd met, the odd jobs he'd taken, and the quiet moments he spent trying to piece himself back together. "I didn't think I'd ever come back," he admitted at one point, his eyes on the fire crackling in the hearth. "But now, I'm glad I did." Elizabeth reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "We're glad too," she said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. Luke watched the family with a quiet smile, his presence calm and reassuring. At one point, he joined Elizabeth in the kitchen to help with a tray of cookies. "You're good at this," she said, watching as he expertly arranged the cookies on a platter. He grinned. "Years of practice. My mom always said presentation matters, even if it's just dessert." Elizabeth laughed, leaning against the counter. "You've been amazing, you know. Helping me find Michael, supporting me through all of this. I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," Luke said, his tone sincere. "Seeing you happy is enough." She looked at him, her heart skipping a beat at the warmth in his eyes. For a moment, the noise of the house faded, and it was just the two of them in the quiet glow of the kitchen. "Luke," she began, her voice soft, but before she could say more, her father called from the living room, interrupting the moment. "Elizabeth." "Luke. Come join us, we're making plans for dinner." Elizabeth smiled, the spell broken but the warmth lingering as she and Luke carried the cookies back into the bustling living room. Later that evening, as they sat down to Christmas dinner, James raised a glass. "I'd like to say something," he began, his voice steady but emotional. "This year, I thought I understood what Christmas was about, giving, hosting, helping others. But having Michael back has reminded me of something much more important. Christmas is about family, about the people we love and the connections we build. And it's about finding ways to give back in meaningful ways." He looked at Michael, then at Elizabeth. "In honor of the lessons we've learned this year, I'd like to announce that the Carter Foundation will be making a significant contribution to the shelter where Michael spent time. It's clear they're doing incredible work, and we want to ensure they have the resources to continue helping others in need." The room erupted into applause, the decision met with smiles and cheers. Elizabeth glanced at Michael, who looked genuinely touched. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of his gratitude. After dinner, the family gathered around the piano, an old tradition that hadn't happened since Michael disappeared. He surprised everyone by sitting down and playing a familiar tune, his fingers finding the keys with surprising ease. I didn't know you still played, Elizabeth said, sitting beside him. I didn't, for a long time, he admitted. But some things you never really forget. As he played, Luke leaned against the doorway, watching Elizabeth with a soft smile. She caught his gaze, her cheeks warming as she realized how much his presence meant to her. When the last notes faded, Michael turned to Elizabeth and James, his expression sincere. Thank you, he said, his voice steady. For not giving up on me. For bringing me home. Elizabeth wrapped an arm around his shoulders, her heart full. That's what family does, she said simply. The evening ended with everyone gathered near the fire, trading stories and sharing quiet moments of joy. Elizabeth leaned back in her chair, watching the flicker of the flames and feeling a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. As she glanced at Luke, who was laughing at something Michael had said, she felt a new kind of warmth bloom in her chest. Maybe this Christmas wasn't just about finding her brother. Maybe it was also about finding something new, something she hadn't even realized she was missing. The first few days after Christmas were a whirlwind for Michael, but they were filled with moments that began to tether him back to the world he had left behind. With Elizabeth and Luke by his side, he ventured into town, reconnecting with places and people he hadn't seen in years. At first, the encounters were tentative, old friends who weren't sure if they should hug him or shake his hand, neighbors who expressed a mixture of joy and curiosity at his return. Michael handled it all with quiet humility, his words thoughtful and careful, but Elizabeth could see the faint glimmers of the confident, charismatic brother she once knew. One morning, Michael visited the shelter where he had spent so much of his time. The staff greeted him warmly, their kindness a reminder of the refuge he had found in those walls when he needed it most. As he walked through the halls, he spoke with a volunteer sorting coats and a young man organizing donations. Watching him, Elizabeth saw something she hadn't seen in years, a spark of purpose. It was in the way he listened intently to their stories and offered ideas for how to make the shelter more welcoming. I think this is where I'm supposed to be, Michael said later as they sat in the shelter's modest cafeteria, the smell of coffee wafting around them. Helping here. Giving back. It feels right. Elizabeth smiled, her heart swelling with pride. Then let's make it happen, she said. Michael glanced at her, his brow furrowing slightly. I mean on my own, he clarified. I don't want to lean on Dad's money or the family name. I want this to be something I build myself. I get that, Elizabeth said, nodding. But what if we find a way to work together? The foundation could partner with the shelter, maybe fund some new programs. It wouldn't be about taking credit, it would be about making a difference. Michael hesitated, considering her words. You really think Dad would go for that? I do, Elizabeth replied. He's already committed to supporting the shelter. I think he'd be proud to have you involved, too. Michael didn't respond right away, but there was a hint of a smile on his face, a quiet acknowledgement of the possibilities ahead. As the days passed, the Carter family began to forge a new rhythm. James surprised everyone by stopping by the shelter to meet the staff and discuss how the foundation could help. Watching him and Michael talk, tentatively at first, but with growing warmth, Elizabeth felt a flicker of hope that the wounds of the past could truly heal. Luke, ever the steady presence, became a fixture in their lives during this time. He offered logistical advice for the shelter project, drawing on his years of volunteer experience, but he also found ways to lighten the mood when conversations grew too heavy. He and Michael quickly developed an easy camaraderie, their shared sense of humor evident in the way they teased Elizabeth during family dinners. Do you always have to have the last word? Michael joked one evening, smirking at his sister as she insisted on explaining her point about the shelter's funding strategy. Always, Luke chimed in before Elizabeth could reply, earning a round of laughter from everyone at the table. It wasn't lost on Elizabeth how much she had come to rely on Luke, not just for his support in finding Michael but for the way he made her feel seen and valued. There was something effortless about being with him, and she found herself looking forward to every moment they spent together. By New Year's Eve, the Carter estate was bustling with preparations for another gathering, but this one was different. Instead of hosting the city's elite, the Carters had invited friends and volunteers from the shelter to celebrate. The transformation was a labor of love, with Michael overseeing the decorations, Elizabeth organizing food and entertainment, and Luke helping coordinate transportation for the shelter guests. As evening fell, the estate glowed with warmth, the sound of laughter and music filling the grand halls. Guests mingled in the living room, sipping cider and sharing stories, while children darted around the tree, their faces lit with excitement. Elizabeth stood by the fireplace, watching the scene with a deep sense of contentment. She spotted Michael across the room, laughing with a group of shelter volunteers, his golden watch gleaming on his wrist. It was a small but significant detail, a reminder of the journey they had taken to get here and the time they had reclaimed as a family. Luke appeared beside her, holding 2 glasses of sparkling cider. "You've outdone yourself," he said, handing her one. "It wasn't just me," she replied, her smile soft. "This was all of us." He nodded, his gaze warm as it rested on her. "Still, it's something special. You brought everyone together, Elizabeth. That's not an easy thing to do." She looked at him, her chest tightening in the best possible way. "You're giving me too much credit," she said, her voice soft. "I don't think I am," he replied, his tone steady. Before she could respond, Michael approached them, his smile wide. "All right, you two. Enough staring into each other's eyes. It's time for carols." Elizabeth rolled her eyes but couldn't help laughing. "Fine. But only if you sing too." "I'll think about it," Michael teased, leading the way to the piano. As the night went on, the Carters and their guests gathered around to sing. Michael played the piano, his fingers moving with ease over the keys, while Elizabeth and Luke joined in with the others, their voices blending in harmony. Snow began to fall outside, the flakes catching the light from the estate's glowing windows. The scene felt almost unreal in its beauty, a reminder that even after years of loss and uncertainty, joy could be found again. As the final notes of the carols faded, Elizabeth glanced around the room, taking in the smiles, the laughter, and the sense of connection that filled the space. For the first time in years, she felt truly at peace. And as she caught Luke's eye from across the room, she realized that this Christmas had brought her not only her brother but also the possibility of something new, a future bright with love, family, and hope.